Henry VII rebuilt England with a ledger instead of a sword. He didn't so much conquer the kingdom as he made the kingdom collect. Most histories follow the crown, and we're going to follow the cash instead. The myth remembers him as a cautious survivor of the Wars of the Roses, a miser, a tax collector, the kind of king who was nervous about the battlefield. But that's the small version of the story. The real machine ran on parchment bonds and wool customs, on royal seals and the rolls the sheriffs kept. Henry filled his government with new men he picked for their command of the law and for their loyalty. And a body called the Council Learned in the Law took ordinary promises and turned them into debts you could actually enforce. Noble privilege started to become a liability. Loyalty turned it into a bill with a seal on it. So instead of destroying feudal power, he put it on a payment schedule. That was the Tudor Revolution. And it looked less like a new crown and more like a new collection system. The monarchy stopped waiting around for obedience and instead started pricing it. Once you see Henry this way, you can't really go back to seeing the Tudor state as some medieval throne. You start seeing the balance sheet sitting behind the crown. Welcome back to Hidden Forces in History. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO of Command Your Brand, and you can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. If you came into this story through the Wars of the Roses, then you already have a sense of the wreckage that Henry Tudor inherited. The throne had changed hands over and over. Noble families had raised private armies, and kings had been beaten, murdered, or driven into exile. The crown itself survived all of it, but the monarchy behind it had been worn down from the inside until there was almost nothing holding it up. What Henry understood was that the battlefield hadn't actually created England's real crisis. It had only exposed it. The deeper problem was control, and it came down to a handful of questions. Who really controlled the land? Who really controlled the money? Who could raise an army? Who could ignore the king when he gave an order? And who had enough leverage to make the king pay for his own survival? Rather than trying to restore the old monarchy, his answer was to replace it outright, and even that didn't happen cleanly. He didn't wake up one morning and invent a modern state. He inherited the old institutions, the old laws and taxes and feudal rights, and he rearranged all of it with a single idea, which was that the king could no longer depend on the goodwill of men who were capable of destroying him. And that meant money, it meant records, it meant officials. And more than anything, it meant turning loyalty into something you could measure and monitor and enforce. The first problem he faced was legitimacy. He won the crown at Bosworth in 1485, but winning a battle didn't automatically make him safe. His claim to the throne was weak by traditional standards of the time, because he came down from the Lancastrian line through a branch that had started out illegitimate. The royal blood was there, it just didn't put him anywhere near the formal line of succession. S.B. Crimes, who biographically is still the standard account of the reign, put it about as bluntly as you can. Measured by strict heredity, Henry's title was almost nothing. What he actually had was possession, and a parliament that was willing to recognize it. His strongest argument was really that he'd won, and that was also exactly where his danger sat. If victory was the thing holding up his crown, then another victory could take it right back off of him. Every nobleman in England could follow that logic. The king could be beaten, a king could be replaced, a king could be made to look temporary. So Henry had to turn a military win into something permanent. He had to make his rule feel older than it actually was, so that rebellion would start to feel less like resistance and more like some new king and some treason against the order that had already been there. That's a big part of why his marriage to Elizabeth of York carried so much weight. She was the daughter of Edward IV, and she carried the Yorkist bloodline that Henry could never claim on his own. Their marriage brought together the two houses that had been fighting each other for generations, so that Lancaster and York effectively became Tudor. It was a powerful symbol, but symbols on their own don't govern anything. A rose on the banner doesn't collect a debt. A wedding doesn't stop a rebellion. And a crown by itself doesn't fill an empty treasury. Henry needed the public image of unity first, and then he needed the actual administrative machinery to make that unity seem like it meant something. Elizabeth gave the dynasty a bridge back to the past, and Henry set about building the machinery that would carry it forward. The old nobility was used to thinking of the monarchy as one of the great lords sitting among other great lords. The king was more powerful, sure, but he was still playing inside the same world that they were. He held the land, but they held the land. He had retainers, but they also had retainers. He had his courts, but they had their own local influence. For generations, the whole English monarchy had run on managing that network of competing powers. And Henry wanted something different out of all of it. He wanted the nobility to stay wealthy and to stay useful, but he did not want them staying independent. That one distinction basically shaped everything he did, because his goal was to make the aristocracy answerable to him, rather than to wipe it out. There's a modern term for what he was reaching for, which is state capacity. It means a government's ability to make decisions and then actually enforce them out beyond its own capital. It's the ability to collect revenue, to identify property, to know who owes what, and to make a decision taken in London actually land in Yorkshire or Kent or Wales, or up by the border country. Henry's monarchy got stronger the moment the king's instructions stopped depending on personal friendship, and that was the real change. The crown started to move through paper. The king's power could now travel through a warrant, a letter, a legal bond, a sealed order, an account. That was slower than a sword, but it lasted a lot longer. A sword could beat a lord one time. A record could follow his estate around for years. The monarchy Henry inherited had money trouble, more or less everywhere. The civil wars had damaged estates. Land had changed hands through confiscation and marriage. And crown property had been handed out to reward allies. Royal officials had a habit of treating public income as a personal opportunity. Meanwhile, the king's household still had to be funded. The court still had to travel. And diplomats still had to be paid. Armies still had to be raised. Castles still had to be kept up. And foreign rulers still expected their gifts and pensions and treaties. And on top of all of that, rebellions were never free. Every pretender needed soldiers. Every campaign needed transport. Every army needed feeding. And every emergency forced the crown to spread money before it had any real way to collect more. Henry couldn't lean on one spectacular tax to fix that. He needed a permanent revenue system, and that system worked in layers. Some of it came from the crown's ordinary rights. Customs duties pulled in money through trade, and wool trade, and especially mattered because England's whole economy was tied to wool exports. Merchants moved wool and wool cloth out through ports, and at those ports, the crown could take its share. That kind of revenue didn't force the king to negotiate from scratch every single time. It just came off the movement of goods, and that really mattered. A tax aimed at one nobleman could provoke resistance, but a duty baked into trade could quietly become routine. And routine income is what government actually stands on. It's less dramatic than a war tax, but it's a lot more reliable. Henry also took a hard look at the crown lands, which weren't just estates in the way we'd picture them now. They were streams of income, coming in as rents and fines and court payments, as rights over forests and the profits of local administration. A crown estate was really an asset you could manage and audit and expand. Give too much of it away, and you were giving away future revenue, but recover some of it, and you were recovering future power. That's why land mattered as much as it did. A medieval monarchy didn't run on some abstract idea of national income. It ran through land and dues and customs and offices and rights. The crown's wealth was scattered across thousands of local transactions, where every manor had its own accounts. Every estate had its own obligations. Every office had fees, and every legal privilege had some value attached to it. The only real question was whether any of that value ever reached the king, and Henry worked to make it reach him more consistently. He recovered lands that drifted away from the crown. He went back and reviewed grants that earlier monarchs had made, chased down feudal dues, and demanded payments tied to wardships and marriage and inheritance. He used forfeitures after rebellions, and he collected fines whenever a political agreement got broken. Now, this wasn't just greed. It was a response to a structural problem, because a king without revenue always has to bargain, while a king with revenue can simply command. And that distinction really is the whole story here. Henry's financial policy usually gets explained through his personality. He was cautious. He was suspicious. He hated spending money he didn't have to spend. He piled up cash, and he expected his debts to get paid. But the personal portrait doesn't take you far enough. The deeper question is what all that money actually let him do. It bought him time, and it bought him options. It let him negotiate with foreign powers without immediately having to go begging Parliament for funds. It let him build up a revenue against rebellion. It let him reward servants who were loyal to the crown itself, instead of some great noble family. And it made the nobility understand, quietly, that rebellion now came with a price tag. And that last part really matters. Henry didn't need to punish every disloyal thought a man might have. He just needed to make disloyal action expensive. The way it usually worked was through a bond, which was really just a financial promise. A nobleman could be made to promise a large sum of money, obey the king, and the bond might never get collected. Break the terms, and suddenly, that debt was real. That created a completely new kind of political pressure, because the king didn't always have to throw a lord in prison or seize his estate. He could just leave him living under constant possibility of financial ruin. It was a different form of power, less about the ability to strike, and more about the ability to wait. The nobleman stayed free. He could keep his land and keep his place in local society. But the royal government was sitting on a document that could turn into a weapon whenever it wanted. The threat was invisible, and that's exactly what made it work. A sword drawn in the street creates resistance, but a sealed bond creates caution. That was the logic underneath Henry's use of recognizances and financial securities. Historian J.R. Lander gave the whole system about the bluntest name you could ever give it, which was bonds coercion and fear. That was the real thing that kept the higher nobility in line. And by the end of the reign, a striking share of the peerage was operating under some kind of financial obligation to the crown. It made political obedience measurable. The crown could ask a nobleman to guarantee his own conduct, or make a city official secure his performance, or demand financial assurances from people whose loyalty everyone used to just assume. And the message underneath all of it was simple. Trust on its own just wasn't enough anymore. Trust had to be written down, and if the trust ever failed, the record, that would still be there. This is the point where Cardinal John Morton comes into the story. Morton was one of Henry's most important servants, a churchman and a lawyer and a diplomat and an ambassador all at once. And he served as both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chancellor. His real value was that he understood how law and money and authority could all reinforce each other. He helped Henry turn the royal government into something that could reach out past the king's own physical presence. There's that famous phrase, Morton's fork, that gets tied to every aggressive taxation. The idea being that a wealthy man living well could obviously afford to pay, and a wealthy man living modestly must be saving so that he could afford to pay too. But the larger system mattered a lot more than the clever little story. Henry's government wasn't trying to guess who looked rich. It was trying to build better information. Who owned which land? Who'd come into an inheritance? Who failed some royal obligation? And who backed a pretender? The more the government knew, the more precisely it could apply pressure, because information itself was the real power. Sir Reginald Bray was another one of the central figures here, and his importance came straight out of administration. He organized the royal finances, he managed information, and he connected the king's household to the wider machinery of government. That was exactly the kind of official that Henry needed. One of what historian Stephen Gunn calls the new men, administrators whose whole standing came from serving the crown, rather than from serving their blood. Their power sat in technical skill, in law and accounts, and the handling of information, and that's what made them so dangerous to the old aristocratic order. A duke could still command men, but a trained administrator could name every single debt attached to that duke's estate. So instead of handing aristocratic power to any kind of equality, the new monarchy slid it into an administrative cage that was basically built out of paper. Henry kept raising the importance of officials whose career depended directly on royal favor. He wanted men who were tied to the government through salaries and advancement. That didn't make them neutral. Of course, they were still political actors who could enrich themselves or make themselves unpopular. But their rise pointed to a real change, which was that the king was building a government that could run on professionals. And that mattered, because the old political system had been so personal. A nobleman's household used to be a government in miniature, with its advisors and its retainers, and its own local influence. Henry wanted the royal household to become the single most important household in the whole country, so that everyone who mattered would need to access to just him, whether or not they actually loved him. It was a system of dependency, with the monarch sitting at the center of the network, and the offices and pensions and legal protection all flowing out of the crown. The same principle ran down into local government. The crown leaned on sheriffs and justices of the peace, and tax collectors, to act as its eyes and its hands out in the country. But a local office could just as easily turn into a private source of power. So Henry's government started paying much closer attention to how well administration was actually being done. The crown needed to know whether its instructions were being carried out at all. A government can issue orders all day long, but the real question is always what happens after the order leaves the capital. Does anyone actually enforce it? Does anyone actually write down the result? Henry's monarchy got stronger because those questions became a lot harder to dodge. The crown started demanding accounts. You're reviewing how people performed, and investigating income that used to just vanish into local hands. It never wiped out corruption, but it made corruption visible. And once something's visible, you can start to control it. The financial system also changed what rebellion even meant. Before Henry, you could dress up a rebellion as a nobleman defending his rights. But Henry worked to strip that ambiguity away. So a rebel became a financial risk instead. A nobleman who backed a pretender could lose his land, and his property could be seized outright. That shifted the whole calculation. A question wasn't just whether a rebellion might succeed anymore. It was whether the nobleman could even survive if the thing failed. Henry's use of attainders was part of the same approach. Sometimes an attainder was permanent, and sometimes it could be reversed. And that reversibility let Henry separate ordinary opponents from permanent enemies. He could punish a lord and then hold out a path back to royal mercy, which turned a pardon into leverage rather than simple compassion. He took uncertainty and made it into a tool, so that the monarchy felt present even when the king himself was nowhere nearby. His paperwork could simply show up at his place. All this developed during years of genuine danger. Back in 1487, Lambert Simnel's rebellion taught Henry that the old political class could still gather itself around a pretender, and that the real danger was the network standing behind that figure, the money and the foreign support, and the noble companions. So Henry kept watch on his nobles and maintained intelligence networks to keep coalitions from ever coming together. Then in 1491, Perkin Warbeck turned up, picking up support from foreign rulers. And that rebellion dragged on for years and tested the loyalty of nobles who might have preferred a different king. But it also fed Henry's strategy, because every supporter was somebody who could be investigated, which created a record you could use later on. Henry would often just wait and gather information, working out who could be bought off or isolated. It was risk management as much as anything else, since a controlled rebellion could actually expose an entire network. The king was learning to govern through intelligence. And that's really why the tax accountant image is so useful here. An accountant looks for patterns in payments and debts, and Henry's government went looking for the same kind of patterns in politics. Who was meeting with whom? Who was traveling where? And who had suddenly come into money? The crown was building a political ledger and tracking behavior across time, and that changed the nature of loyalty and authority itself. Reputation was now backed up by documentation, and that documentation could outlive a witness and travel a lot further than the king could have ever traveled himself. This was how centralized power actually worked, as a slow, steady accumulation of information and an expansion of royal oversight that kept shrinking the space between where powerful men could act, without having to explain themselves. The system also handed Henry more control over Parliament. He still needed grants for certain taxes, but a steady income cut his dependence on the extraordinary ones. A monarch with his own independent income gets to choose when negotiation is even necessary. Henry wanted to break the old cycle, where a king asks for funds and then hands over concessions to get them, which just leaves the crown more dependent every single time. War and diplomacy were still expensive, but the direction he was heading was clear enough. The crown needed a stronger financial base before it could really become politically independent, and the money was the foundation for all of it. His careful approach to war came straight out of the same financial logic. He didn't go chasing glory for its own sake, because that would have been dangerous. He preferred limited campaigns and diplomacy that was backed by credible force. When he invaded France in 1492, the Treaty of Empson came with all of the pensions attached. So he'd taken military pressure and turned it into a revenue stream. As historians like John Guy have pointed out, Henry tended to treat foreign policy as just another branch of royal accounts. What he was after was compliance, because the crown needed every nobleman to understand what resistance would actually cost. He handled the Scottish border the same way, marrying his daughter Margaret to James IV, and buying stability through a relationship that he could reinforce with law and finance. It was all strategic accounting, always circling the same question of what leverage the crown could gain. Henry approached the whole monarchy as a system of assets and liabilities. A marriage was an asset, a rebellion was a liability, and the crown's job was to grow the first column while shrinking the second. The marriage to Elizabeth of York was itself a calculation, joining the rival houses and giving the dynasty a future, which is how military victory quietly turns into family succession. And that's how a conqueror becomes a founder. But the legitimacy and financial control were always working together, because Henry needed both the public story of reconciliation and the private machinery of reinforcement. And that tension got sharper toward the end of the reign, as officials like Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley rose up as the agents of this whole system of financial obligations. Empson and Dudley ended up becoming the human face of a lot of government that a lot of people experienced as intrusive. The system was keeping the monarchy solvent, but the men enforcing it grew deeply unpopular. They were the cold edge of an administrative monarchy, the place where the paperwork turned into punishment. The king could tell himself that he was just enforcing the rules, while the subject on the other end experienced the whole thing as oppression. And that's a recurring problem, because an efficient government can start to feel frightening. Henry's financial system reached its most controversial shape late in his reign, as the treasury kept growing. The crown seemed to know too much and claim too much, and that was really the problem of centralization, of making the monarchy impersonal, even though ordinary people still met it through very personal officials like Empson and Dudley. The success of this system was that it actually created the anger that eventually consumed the men running it. When Henry died in 1509, Empson and Dudley were arrested and then executed. And their fall led Henry VIII step forward as the more generous king. But the machinery itself never went anywhere. Henry VIII inherited a monarchy stronger, with more capacity and more officials, who already knew how to administer power. The personality of the monarch had changed, but the deeper structural transformation survived him. It was never a perfect modern bureaucracy, and the crown still relied on personal relationships and noble allies to prove that it could actually punish a rebellion when it had to. But force was now backed by information, and information was backed by law and money. And that chain is really the legacy here. The king now could decide who got access to power, who received a pardon, and which debts were going to get collected. The nobility stayed powerful, but the crown became much harder to manipulate. Henry had made aristocratic power legible, and once something is legible, it becomes governable. This was the moment the English monarchy started to behave like an organized institution. The modern connection is that Henry understood compliance systems, and the strongest government is the one that gets people to organize their own behavior before force ever has to enter the picture. The crown could define the rules of the marketplace without physically standing in every one of them, and it could make rebellion look like far too much risk without beating every rival on the battlefield. The authority got embedded into the systems themselves. Same playbook, different century. Power gets durable once it can measure what it used to have to guess at. Henry VII pushed England towards centralization, taking public authority and turning it into private obligation. And that quiet work is what let the Tudor monarchy dominate the century that came after. Before Henry VIII or Elizabeth could ever command a transformation, they first had to command money and stop the nobility from treating the crown as something negotiable. The story really starts with the accountant, the man who asked what the crown owned and what the nobility owed, and who understood that a stable monarchy needed a permanent system underneath it. He answered the wreckage of the Wars of the Roses by surrounding the throne with legal and financial obligations. The new monarchy joined the rival houses together and made the cost of opposing the crown deeply personal. And in the end, it didn't need swords at all. It needed paperwork. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want more Hidden Forces in History.